morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Monday, April 26th, 2021. And on this episode, we're looking at the strategic advice of leading founders and old revolutionaries like Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, and Samuel Adams of how to be successful at building a foundation for liberty brick by brick, step by step. And I've got a real world example from Montana, and I'm not sure if they're really like basing their strategy over a number of years, over a period of 8 years, basically following this advice, running into roadblocks, following the advice again, and then getting a win on the board just this last week, Friday, for the Second Amendment and for the Constitution and liberty in Montana. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. There you're going to find everything you need to follow this program, all the archives for closing in on 3 years. On individual episodes like this one today, I'm going to link to letters from Jefferson. I'm going to link to one from Samuel Adams. I've got some articles, stuff that you can read and learn more on your own time. You can find all the different platforms we're on. If you happen to watch us on the live stream, where we mostly stream on the mainstream platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, and Twitter. We're also streaming on DLive and hopefully Odyssey.com soon. But if you notice us missing all of a sudden someday, we've got a bunch of other platforms that we post in the archive, like Gab TV, MeWe Minds, Brighteon, BitChute, BitTube, and elsewhere. And we do have the audio-only podcast edition, Podbean, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and elsewhere. And you can also find our membership program on that same show homepage, where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Again, that show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I hope you had a great weekend. I appreciate you being here to kick off your week on a Monday. And I'm going to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while we allow people a few more moments to get notifications to join us on the live stream. Tim Martin, good to see you down in Arizona. Dixie Strong in Bama. Clay Kent, Dan Reed, Patricia Dance in Syracuse, the grand depot of the Underground Railroad in the days of nullifying the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s. Alan Hughes, MRGF, Greg in Temple, Texas. Good to see you, Greg. That Liberty gal in Dallas, Fort Worth. Jim Black, Larry Clark, Murray Ray in Michigan. And, back to Larry Clark, talking about Chris Ann Hall. She's at Boston Harbor today. That's pretty cool. Anyways, I appreciate you all being here. I apologize if I missed anyone. And let's get to this. And I want to start out with Thomas Jefferson. And for those of you who watch or listen to the show regularly, you're going to recognize these quotes that I'm putting together, primarily from Jefferson to kick off, but through the episode, back to him, then Dickinson, and then also Samuel Adams. But I think putting them into context of how it's playing out in Montana before our very eyes is very instructive. And here, this important letter from Thomas Jefferson to his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay. This is on January 27th, 1790. And I cannot repeat this one enough because it really guides our approach here at the TAC so much. And here's how Jefferson put it. The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. That we must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. He knew from experience, and I'm certain the Reverend Clay also knew from experience, coming through the revolution, that you don't get from point A to point B or point Z in one fell swoop. You don't defeat the mightiest empire in the history of the world and advance liberty in one piece of legislation, one action, one anything. And he put it this way. Jefferson said, it takes time to persuade men to do even what is for their own good. So you can tell people, you can wave books in people's faces, you can tell them to watch videos or watch my podcast or listen to it, or read articles. You can tell them till you're blue in the face, but you have to show them. It takes time to persuade people to do what's even best for them. Of course, we know that fear is the foundation of most governments, as John Adams put it, or probably all governments really is really the best way to put it. I'll correct Mr. Adams there. And people are very afraid of doing what's for their own good when they believe that it's going to be dangerous, especially when we live under this largest government in the history of the world. And we've had so much government propaganda that without government, everything will fall to pieces. So Jefferson, it takes time to persuade men to do what is even for their own good. He knew this back in 1790 and probably much earlier. And that brings me to Montana. Just last week, Friday, House Bill 258 from Representative Jedediah Hinkle, this is from the Montana Shooting Sports Association, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, was signed into law by the governor. The new law prohibits, and this is a report by Mike Meharry, the new law prohibits police officers, state employees, and employees of any political subdivision of the state from enforcing, insisting in the enforcement of, or otherwise cooperating in the enforcement of any new, get this, it's pretty long, federal law, executive order, rule, regulation that is enacted, adopted, or becomes effective on or after January 1st, 2021, or a new and more restrictive interpretation of an existing law that existed before that date, that infringes upon, calls in question, or prohibits, restricts, or requires individual licensure for or registration of the purchase, ownership, possession, transfer, or use of any firearm, any magazine, or other ammunition feeding device, or other firearm accessory. So any new, basically, federal gun control measure that is implemented after January 1st. So it's a kind of retroactive. It went into effect on April 26, 2021. So it's immediate effect, but it's also retroactive for any new federal measure that would restrict the right to keep and bear arms in any way, really. And it's a great line in the sand. So it sounds like it's taking Jefferson's advice. Really, of course, we want to deal with all federal gun control. We want to stop all of it on the state level, too. But if we're talking about a strategy to undermine and defeat federal programs, which is this banning the use of resources, using anti-commandeering, James Madison's advice to ban enforcement on a state and local level, this is a great step. And then you might be thinking, well, this is Montana, dude. Why did they only deal with the stuff on the books going forward that might come down the line, rather than all the other stuff? National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 68, the amendments in 86, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 88, the bump stock ban of 2018. Why didn't they do all that? This is Montana. This is like a gun rights state. And what the heck's going on? I mean, I like the idea of Jefferson's approach of the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, but if you're only going for inches when you should be going for miles, there's a problem. But wait, they actually did go for much more. And here from Mike's report again, as introduced, House Bill 258 would not just have applied to new or potentially new federal measures that restrict our natural right to keep and bear arms. It would have applied, as Mike writes, to most all current federal gun control as well. So they introduced this bill. This was a MSSA bill that was sponsored by Representative Hinkle there, and it would have addressed most federal measures on the books, past, present, and future. And Mike writes, but after some aggressive opposition to the bill from the Montana Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, the bill was tabled and effectively dead in committee. This was a report from back in April, this was the report. Sorry, this is the report on the bill getting signed into law, but this happened in the past month or so, where they lobbied really aggressively against this in the House. And here from the Montana Daily Gazette, they say they have learned that the sticking point in the bill for the Montana Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association is the term violent. In short, MSPOA wants the power to remove firearms of all felons, even for a nonviolent process crime. So when they had a chance to move the bill forward, it failed in committee by a vote of 4-15. So what would most people do in response? I mean, you basically said, well, we want to ban the state from participating in the enforcement of most any. I mean, there's probably some loopholes, but you got to get something on the board and work with it and find how they try to work and end one around. And it's a little bit of a whack-a-mole, but they went for a very broad piece of legislation there in House Bill 258 in Montana. And in most situations, what I see most people do, most organizations, is they pack it up. They go home, they try it again, and they say, well, next time we'll get them. Or option two is they pack it up and they go home and they say, well, we're going to vote the bums out and just change the representatives, and then we'll get this thing passed next time. Or they pack it up and go home and they just give up. Basically, most organizations, most activists really have a pack it up and go home approach after one attempt, maybe two, that fails. Again, but we have this reminder from Thomas Jefferson. It, quote, takes time to persuade men to do even what is for their own good. And in fact, it is for the good of the Montana Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. It really is for their own good as well to protect the natural right to keep and bear arms, to stand for the Constitution, to stand for liberty, to stand for the Second Amendment all the time, even if they think they have some financial benefit from supporting federal gun control measures. It really does take time to persuade people to do this. And another piece of advice from Jefferson in his letter to James Madison, November 17th, 1798. You might be familiar with that date, maybe the year of 1798, the year of the Alien and Sedition Acts from John Adams and the Federalists back, man, they've sure jumped the shark back then. But in response to that, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison secretly authored the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions calling for nullification and interposition against the federal Alien and Sedition Acts, the very hated laws in those states. And the day after it passed in Kentucky, this is what Jefferson sent to James Madison. He said, I enclose you a copy of the draft of the Kentucky resolves. I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain so as to hold to that ground in the future, and here's the key strategic advice, and leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities, and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. So he's still using this same approach, the same mental approach, the same advice that he offered to Charles Clay, the Reverend Clay, back in 1790. Here it is, 8 years later, and he's basically saying, look, we have to have our ultimate principles. We don't let go of the principles, our ultimate goal. But at the same time, we recognize that events on the ground may not allow us to get everything we want in one fell swoop. We have to push as far as events will render prudent. And in many situations, this is a very difficult thing to figure out. How far can you push? Well, one way to learn is to try to push as far as you can. And then when you fail to push as far as you can, or you try to push and you don't get anywhere, what can you do? And that brings me to this organization that I mentioned, the Montana Shooting Sports Association. I'm sorry for those of you watching on video that the header of their website is cut off, but it's mtssa.org. I think, and I know a lot of people point out to GOA as a great national organization, but as far as a strategic grassroots, on the ground, state level, state and local level, right to keep and bear arms organizations, to me, there is none better than mssa.org. It's headed up by a guy named Gary Marbut, who is incredibly principled and really just like, man, if you get in his way, and I have gotten in his way in the past, he is not going to mess around because his friend is advancing liberty. And if you're doing something that he disagrees with, you're going to know about it. So MSSA has really, really taken small strides year in and year out. Sometimes they're very big strides since the 80s, advancing the right to keep and bear arms in Montana. And wow, I'm getting notifications from my Facebook profile here. I'm sorry about that. Anyways, let's look at this quote from Gary. This is from a statement that Gary posted on their Facebook page last week talking about the passage of House Bill 258. And we can see how, and I'm not sure if he was thinking about Jefferson's advice here. I know he's very familiar with these types of things and understands how you can't always get everything you want in day one, and you have to teach people, you have to rally them to the cause, and you have to be persistent. You have to have fortitude and perseverance, which we'll get to in a little bit from Samuel Adams. But he got the idea for this type of legislation back in 2011. I think we started actually only pushing this type of thing on a state and local level, probably 2012 or so. So he got it from Judge Andrew Napolitano, who said, look, you just have to ban resources from helping the feds, and this is going to be very effective. So he put that into practice. They have an every other year legislative session in Montana. More states should actually do this. But he said in 2013, it was introduced as House Bill 302. They did the broad type of legislation. I can't remember the details of that bill, but it was addressing a broad range, past, present, and future of federal gun control, saying they would not participate in enforcement. That was passed by the legislature, House Bill 302, from Representative Creighton Kearns, but it was vetoed by then Governor Bullock. So 2013 gives it shot number one. Could have packed it up and said, we're out of here. This isn't going to work. But he goes again. 2015, House Bill 203 from Representative Art Wittich. She did a really good job shepherding that bill through the legislature. It was passed by the legislature and then vetoed by the governor, and they did not have enough votes to override. It was very close, I think, that second time. Then they did a third time. Here's persistence. In 2017, Senate Bill 99 from Senator Kerry Smith. Again, it was passed by the legislature and then vetoed by Bullock. And then, so what they did was they waited the next session. They knew that the same thing was going to happen. They didn't have the numbers to override, so they focused on some other priorities in 2019. They got a few things passed, and then once they got a governor that was clearly going to sign, as a different governor than Bullock, they said, like, look, let's do this again. Let's go for the broad-ranging one. So they tried 3 times. It was passed and vetoed. They waited for a governor who would sign. Then they went through with it. And then rather than throw in the towel, they used the strategic advice of Thomas Jefferson. They push as far as events will render prudent. They tried to go for the broad-ranging one, but now that the vetoing governor is out of the way, then law enforcement lobby groups get in there and work to get the bill killed. But of course, it's not just them. They're not just the bad guys. It's the people who are willing to say, you know what, this lobby organization wants us to kill this bill. We're going to have to go along with them. So it was the 15 people who voted against it who are a serious problem. So he could have just packed it up and said, well, let's focus on getting these people kicked out of office and we'll wait till next time. No, instead of doing that, he recognized that he could. He worked it out behind the scenes with the sponsor, with the opposition. Hey, can we get this bill passed with at least a line in the sand, a small step forward, the ground of liberty to be gained by inches, get something on the board? And then in 5 years, it's not like it's only just new federal gun control measures that they won't be enforcing. It'll be some old ones because it's anything after 2021. And once it's on the board, then you can do a follow-up and build more and more for the future. And that's basically what Gary was suggesting in that same statement. And here's how Mike quoted it in our article as well. He said, let HB 258 be a signal to the policymakers in D.C. that Montana doesn't need or want a raft of new federal gun control, and that we won't help them enforce it if they send it our way. Senator Tester, are you listening? Plus, we can always run our sheriff's first bill again, basically saying that the sheriff's going to interpose and prevent that type of enforcement. So he's already forward thinking of what to do next. So if they try to do enforcement of new federal gun control, the state stands down on enforcing, the feds come in and do it anyways. He's got strategies to try to address that in the future. And I'm pretty certain, based on 30 years of their work there, that they're probably looking to expand on House Bill 258 year in and year out, and then start addressing maybe another small piece of something that's on the books, and then another small piece when the world doesn't end, when they stop enforcing new federal measures or measures that start on or after January of 2021, maybe they can go back to 2020 or 2018 or 1988 or 1986, and you can keep working your way back and build on it. That reminds me, or that really actually brings me to John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, in his great Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania Against the Hated Towns and Acts of 1767. Take this, for example, from an article, which you can find on most pages of our website, on the official 10th Amendment Center membership cards for annual members. It's a phrase, Concordia res parve criscunt. It's a Latin phrase written by John Dickinson in the first of those letters. And what he was saying was, small things grow great by concord. He knew that the colonies could not just overturn or nullify or stop the enforcement of the New York Restraining Act at that time, the Townsend Acts more broadly. And he thought they should just take a small step, get something on the board that takes a stand or at least takes a principled position against them. And once you do that, One small step leads to another, leads to another, and leads to another. It's the same advice that Jefferson gave to Charles Clay a couple of decades later and then offered to James Madison in 1798. Small things grow great by concord. I actually did an entire episode just on Dickinson's phrase, which is so important to our work here as well, back in June of 2019 as a part of a 4-part series to celebrate our anniversary, which is the end of June each year. It's going to be 15 years for TAC this June. But I encourage you to check out that episode. I think it's a really interesting history. It's a really interesting approach to strategy. It's very important to understand how the founders and revolutionaries did these things. And Dickinson was certainly one of the greats. His papers were the most widely read documents on American liberty up until the point that Thomas Paine's Common Sense was published in January of 1776. So I will link to that in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now back to Montana. If we're thinking about okay, they've got a line in the sand. They've got something small on the books rather than nothing. They had nothing. They went for something very broad. They should have been able to, you'd think, well, it's not the organization's fault, but it's the fact that so many people are so willing to say, well, if this law enforcement lobby group, and it's not even the individual law enforcement officers, because Gary was talking, he posted sometime during this process, the individual officers didn't want to be enforcing federal gun control measures either that he was talking to, or there are many, but this lobby organization holds so much sway and people in the legislature are okay with that. And then the general public are okay with the legislators following whatever the lobby organization says, because you got to be with the law enforcement, thin blue line kind of garbage, but they're the ones lobbying against protecting the Second Amendment. They're supporting the president in restricting your natural rights. So we got something on the board, but small things don't grow great by concord if you don't keep pushing for more. The only way that you build that foundation for liberty by inches is to continually do more and more and more. And that's why I like the fact that Gary, even in his statement on passage, says, look, we've got something to follow up on this as needed. And that brings me to Samuel Adams in his great essay in the Boston Gazette, written as Candidus. This is October 14th, 1771. And this is his advice on following this path. He said, instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, which is the wish of our enemies, the necessity of the times, more than ever, calls for our utmost circumspection, deliberation, fortitude, and perseverance. And that's how we can apply this advice to what's happening in Montana and actually what's happening in many places around the country. If you read our annual State of the Nullification Movement report at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, it's updated for 2019 and 2020, and it'll be updated for 2021 sometime later in the summer. You can see how there's been all kinds of small steps for the Constitution and liberty taken in states that you may not even think would do something on issues like the right to keep and bear arms, of course, but on civil asset forfeiture, on warrantless surveillance, on healthcare freedom, on prohibition, all across the spectrum of issues. But they're all small steps. Some of them are larger than others. Some of them, you see, it's a follow-up action. For example, in West Virginia in 2017, they passed a law, a Direct Primary Care Act, that actually opts certain types of coverage in the direct primary care model, which you can read about on your own, but it opts it out from the burdensome, it's such a weight, the regulation in the state insurance codes. Some of it is basically outside of that regulatory state. And then this year they did a follow-up that said, look, we're going to expand this to all medical services, not just certain limited ones. So you start with one thing, you build it to another, you keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And that's what people like Gary Marbut and the Montana Shooting Sports Association have been doing for years and years. This is exactly what people like Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, and here again from Samuel Adams. We can't just be we're very happy to see HB 258 signed as law in Montana. It's a small step. It's an important foundational step. But instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, which is the wish of our enemies, that couldn't be more applicable than anything. The necessity of the times, Adams wrote, more than ever calls for our utmost circumspection, deliberation, fortitude, and perseverance. I thought that was worth reading a second time there. And I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More than anything, I hope you learned something. And really, this type of approach Again, it's really a gray area. How hard can you push? How aggressively? How much can you go for in one step? Every time you do that, you're going to learn something. Maybe you get it. It's very unlikely because even the best of the best, even the so-called good guys on the state and local level generally are pretty bad on the Constitution and liberty. They may be good on one issue, but it's really, really hard to get this type of work done, and it takes a lot of dedication. You can see how in Montana they started this process. If you think about it, the legislative idea from Judge Knapp came in 2011, and here it is a decade later before they got something on the books in a state where you think this should be easy peasy, clear sailing. So I hope you guys learned something from this and can replicate it on issues. It doesn't even have to be the right to keep and bear arms. It can be whatever is important to you. Recognize that you try for something, maybe you have to work your way down and build up, and you have to really be dedicated to the cause. Patricia Dance says, love the Samuel Adams quote, especially the one that follows the highlighted portion. Oh yeah, this is good. Well, let me pull this one up again. That's a good reminder. He said, Adams goes further. He says, let us remember that if we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it and involve others in our doom. It is a very serious consideration which should deeply impress our minds that millions yet unborn may be the miserable sharers in the event. Thank you for mentioning that, Patricia. The whole letter, we actually need to start publishing some of these original letters and documents on our website. We're going to eventually have a whole section there as well. Greg says over on YouTube, how to eat an elephant, one bite at a time. Absolutely. Tim Martin, a great reminder here as well. And I know we've talked about this in regards to the small to medium step forward that was just signed into law in Arizona, House Bill 2111, which goes into effect this summer. The end game should be no enforcement of any federal gun control, past, present, and future. But to go from 0 to 100, you don't do that in your car. You don't learn how to play a guitar in one day. You don't learn how to do woodworking or cooking or broadcasting, doing live streaming. You don't learn how to do anything in one fell swoop. We have to take a step by step by step, and this should be very obvious. Unfortunately, people think only of the ultimate principles. Those of you who are heavily in the libertarian world or the ANCAP world might be familiar with a guy named Murray Rothbard, who years ago actually advised libertarians. He's like, just parroting ultimate principles, that's how Rothbard put it, is not enough for libertarians to cope with the real world. Of course, we want to have the ultimate principles, but thinking you're going to get to them in one day is actually impossible. In fact, what it does, if you pack it up, if you would have packed it up after that vote, 4-15 in Montana, losing, if you pack it up and go home, then Montana, once they institute new federal gun control measures, would have been doing what they do all along, what every state does. Whether you want to think so or not, but every state helps the federal government in enforcement of most federal programs, and heavily so on prohibition of plants and firearms and things like that as well. They are almost always involved, the way a gun raid almost always goes. Now, sometimes it does not. There are some certain examples. In fact, there was one, I think, in Flathead in Montana where it was almost all ATF agents, but that is very, very rare, and they don't have the manpower to sustain that in all the states all the time. They tried this on cannabis. They tried, right before legalization started in Colorado, they did the largest series of raids in history as a warning, don't do this. 6 weeks later, they open up, tens of thousands of people, billions of dollars made. Then they switched over to Montana for a while. They switched to California. They target people, and they really do harm people's lives by doing this enforcement. But over time, when enough people have the fortitude and perseverance to stand up for liberty in the face of the largest government in the history of the world, eventually they're going to have to back down. And that's really how Jefferson put it. He says, we can't expect to go from where we are to where we want to be in a feather bed. It's not going to be easy. Erwin Haverneck says, inches are the beginning. It's basically the old Lao Tzu phrase of the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Greg says, this is similar to House Bill 2622 in Texas. Yes, I've got a little bit of an issue with Texas. Sorry. I mean, I love Texas. I love the people and the friends that I have there. When I get to visit, I always have a great time. What a great place, right? But the politicians drive me insane. This is a place that should be as independent and strong as possible, like the people tend to be there. But House Bill 2622 is very similar to the Montana bill of House Bill 258. It would ban the state from enforcing any new federal gun control. I think that's a win if that's all you can get. Now, there's been another bill, House Bill 635, that is far broader, from Representative Matt Krause or Kraus. I'm not sure how to say his last name. I think he's from Dallas-Fort Worth, or just from Fort Worth. And he introduced a much broader bill that would have addressed federal gun control, most of it past and present as well. Some exceptions, but a far broader piece of legislation than 2622. They were in the same committee, and the governor actually decides to put his weight behind the bill that only addresses the new stuff. They didn't even try. They didn't even have a hearing on the broader bill. At least in Montana, what they did was the right thing. They went for it all. They went aggressively, or they went for much more. They tried. They knew they had something in their back pocket. I mean, when you have two pieces of legislation and they reject a stronger one, then you can go to the other one. But they didn't even have a hearing on the one. The governor never even called for it. The governor said, we need to make this a sanctuary state, and started telling people, tweeting out a link to the lesser bill. I mean, it really is a lesser bill. It is a positive one, but where they're failing in the strategy is they only went for the inches. They didn't actually try to go more aggressively. Hopefully that will pass. Hopefully that will pass, and I'm not sure if there's even time to get forward with House Bill 635, but House Bill 2622 was passed out of that committee already. So they are taking this inches step by step towards liberty approach in Texas, but I think they're being a little too weak. Texas should be have a little more backbone on these things. Oh, Greg says it's dead in committee. Oh, well, see, what a surprise. J. Armstrong says, liberty and freedom are not prohibited. Well, they certainly try to, and in practice, they do. Now, the thing is, as long as human action, as long as people continue to follow that, wait for their liberty, wait for permission from government before they exercise their rights, of course, government will never stop restricting it or passing laws, so-called laws, we'll put that in quotes, that restrict their right to keep and bear arms. As Thomas Jefferson, again, we'll go back to Jefferson, as Jefferson put it, he says, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. So if you're going to be a free people, you have to start learning how to exercise your rights, whether the government people want you to or not. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I will read more of the comments a little bit later on. I will reply to as many as possible, primarily on YouTube. If you support the show, you enjoyed this episode, you like what we do here at TAC, help us spread the word, please. Smash the like button. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Leave some comments in the archive. Share links. All that stuff triggers the algorithm of the mainstream platforms, and it tells them to show the program to more people, and it is helping us reach a lot more. I can't thank you enough. And of course, as I mentioned in the introduction, if you'd like to put your financial faith behind a work, I see a bunch of people out there who are members, and I couldn't be more grateful for your support, because we couldn't get this job done without it. We couldn't reach and teach more and more people every single day. But if you'd like to join in and help us out, don't feel obligated to do so. We're going to continue doing this show. We're hitting our 15-year anniversary. Nothing's stopping us at this point. But if you want us to do more, $2 a month certainly does go a long way. It's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you being here with me today. I hope you had a great weekend. Thank you for starting your Monday off with me, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.